If you've been following our channel for any length of time, you know that our family made an almost 4,000-mile move from the lower Midwest to the Kenai Peninsula. Yeah, that's in Alaska. If you look at a map of the U.S., you might not realize until you try to find our new home state that most of the time Alaska doesn't even show up on a map of the U.S. Like map makers have just forgotten about us. Hello, we're not down here, we're up there. And we're big. Like, Texas should be embarrassed about their size big. Just kidding, we still love you, Texas. But moving up here, moving giant breed dogs up here, that is no joke. Well, how did we do it? In the immortal words of Elmer Fudd, we did it very, very carefully. Let's start with a definition. And before some of you think that you have a big dog, you cute people with your labs or German shepherds, they're robust dogs and absolutely worthy of your smooches. But my dogs, my sweet babies, are a combined 260 plus pounds of Anatolian shepherd love. Anatolians are considered a giant breed, and even though my two dogs aren't considered big for the breed, my boy especially is long, 40 inches long, from his nose to his rump, not including his cute curly tail. To give you a representation, my boy is probably bigger than the bed in your kid's room. So, what's the big deal anyway? Well, moving dogs is complex enough. Moving giant breed dogs is even more complex. Ours are, or at least were, working livestock guardian dogs, or LGD, which again just adds to the complexity. LGD are a classification of dogs that are considered a working group. For LGD purists, these dogs stay on their farm with their flock 24/7 in all weather and environments. I'll put a link in the video description if you wanted to learn more about LGD, but in short, ours were not used to leaving the farm beyond that yearly trip to the vet, which resulted in much complaining and rending of dog garments, also known as, "I'm really sorry that my dog did that on your floor." Our vet was about a 10-minute ride from our farm. Alaska, well, it was more, much, much more. So we started where everyone should start: reading, asking, looking, and more reading. We did a lot of research to figure out the best way to move our dogs in such a way that it caused the least amount of stress on them possible. We reached out to multiple pet transportation companies, and I'll link to a couple of them in the video description. Some were really responsive and gave us great information to consider. Others conveniently lost our phone number when they heard that we needed them to move a couple of LGD that were also giant breed dogs. And others demonstrated such a patent lack of understanding around what it meant to handle an LGD that we knew our options were limited. If you've ever wondered how people get this done, you really have basically 4 different options. Number 1, you can charter a private plane and have them transport your dogs from old home to new home. And this is a terrific option if you're made out of money. We, however, are not. Option 2 would be that you could hire a pet transportation company to move them from old home to new home. Now, some companies do this as a volume move, meaning that your animals will be in a larger van with other animals making moves somewhere along the route. In my discussion with the better pet transportation companies, we both agreed that mixed company really wasn't the right option for my dogs. They would have to be alone in the van with no other animals. And even then, while I'm confident that my dogs would have been in great hands, I had great consternation about someone who wasn't me handling them in and out of the van each day during the overnight stays. My dogs aren't merely giant breed, they're working dogs, and they have a very strong bond with us. They're not going to have that kind of a bond with the nice but still random person moving them. So we ultimately nixed this option out of an abundance of caution for both the dogs and the person driving them. So really that meant the final 2 options involved us driving them at least part of the way, which is what we opted to do. We drove them from southern Missouri to Seattle, and it was about a 2,000-mile drive. We kept the dogs in the back of Mr. What Does Alaska's enclosed truck, and they were in large kennels with regular walks and access to food and water the whole time. And then they stayed with us every night when we stopped. And they had been crate trained as puppies, and we were very thankful that training held, and they responded so positively. Other than that time that Penry ate his leash. Twice. Thankfully, there were plenty of stores along the way for us to buy new leashes for him. And then as part of the final two options, we still had to make choices once we arrived in Seattle. We could either put the dogs on the ferry that runs between Bellingham, Washington, and places like Whittier, Alaska, along with one or both of our vehicles. This is known as the Alaska Marine Highway, and I'll link to it in the video description. While that may seem like an okay choice, as I understand it, non-service animals spend the whole trip in the vehicle they're associated with. They get to come out for brief respites for bathroom breaks. And while I want to recognize that other people may have had different experiences, everyone in authority that I talked to really cautioned me against this because it can involve pretty rough seas and generally can be quite difficult for the animal. So we nixed this option, which meant flying wasn't really our last viable option. While we could have driven from the US into Canada, it's not a straight shot as much as you might think. And driving another 2,000 miles on the Alaska-Canada Highway, also known as the Alcan, during winter sounded nearly as much fun as getting an enema from a provider with chronically cold hands. So we opted to fly with our dogs and our cats while we sent our vehicles on a cargo ship. Now, we found that not all airlines were created equal when it came to flying animals into Alaska, especially in the dead of winter. Some airlines wouldn't fly animals at all unless ground conditions were above a certain temp, and that temp was not typical for Alaska winter. Other airlines fly animals into Alaska, but wouldn't fly dogs as large as ours. We also explored flying the dogs through a cargo carrier, which would have had them fly in a large custom-built crate, but the problem was that it may or may not have been ready to go by the time we needed to fly. So at the end of all of it, we ended up using Alaska Airlines, and we were pleased with the experience. Now, it wasn't a perfect process, and we ended up missing our first flight because we really underestimated how long it would take to get the dogs checked in. The check-in process was extensive. Our crates had to be closely inspected, our vet paperwork had to be closely inspected, and the dogs themselves had to be carefully inspected. This process took easily over 2 hours, and that was even before we went through security ourselves with the cats. And the cats, well, that's a story for another video. Now, you might be thinking, well, dummy, why didn't you just show up for your flight a lot earlier? And that's a great question, but honestly, it's just not an option. For most airlines, you have to arrive within a Goldilocks zone. That is a certain number of hours before your flight. So showing up 6 hours before our flight, it just wasn't an allowable option. After being delayed nearly 17 hours, we finally were able to get on flights. And yeah, I mean flights plural. Mr. What Does Alaska and our daughter flew with the dogs and a couple of cats on one flight, while I flew with the rest of the cats on another flight. By the time we all landed in Alaska in the middle of the night in a blizzard, we were ready to be done. Fast forward a year now, and the dogs are becoming acclimated to the Alaskan way of life. When we arrived, it was still winter, so we've almost covered a whole year of seasonal changes at the point of this video. Now, the dogs don't love winter in terms of not having full access to run around our property because of the snow, but summer was an absolute delight for them. Anatolians are often barkers by nature, and ours are no exception. They bark when there's danger, when they have a question, when they come on duty, and sometimes they just bark because they're alive and they enjoy it. We call this last option recreational barking. And unfortunately, it seemed to happen the most around 9 o'clock at night in the summer. They've had a few minor run-ins with the local moose, and they've wisely decided that they no longer want to tangle with these large creatures. We've also had quite a few bald eagles cruising our property, looking for access to our flock of chickens, but this is not a new predator to the dogs, as our farm in Missouri also had frequent bald eagle shoppers. The dogs have alerted to these big Alaskan eagles as much as they did in Missouri. Now, we don't yet have any evidence of other predatory visitors, such as bear, lynx, or any of the other predators who would love to make a snack of our small stock animals. But we know, as with everything else in Alaska, it's always a possibility. So that's the story of how we moved two giant breed working dogs to Alaska. Thanks for listening and hearing more about how we navigated this move. Have you made a similar move? We would love to hear your stories. Drop a comment below and keep watching as we answer the question of what does Alaska?